Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we will be discussing COP15 challenges and opportunities in mobilizing the private sector. My name is Yanis Ioannou, and I'm an associate professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School. I would like to first start by thanking the Wheeler Institute at London Business School for supporting and hosting this webinar. And I would like to share with you that this webinar is part of a broader initiative that London Business School is participating in. The initiative is called Business Schools for Climate Leadership, and it's a partnership between 8 of Europe's leading business schools to help present and future leaders combat the climate crisis facing the planet. Now, first, let me start also with apologies, because one of our panelists, Ms. Marie Haga, sends her own apologies as well. Due to last-minute personal reasons, she was not going to be able to join us. But I'm delighted to welcome Mark Goff to the webinar, and with whom we have so many things to discuss. So we'll run this as a fireside chat. I'm going to introduce Mark in more detail in a second, but I would like just to say that during our conversation with Mark, we will be monitoring the chat function. So I would love to see any questions that you have on the topics that we are discussing coming in live, and I'll moderate and ask and pose those questions to Mark. But at the same time, we're also going to leave some time towards the end of this webinar for even more questions. I understand that we have people both on Zoom as well as live streaming on YouTube. So we will be monitoring those questions as well. And the Wheeler team in the background will be feeding those questions to me as well. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar today with Mark. In my view, unfortunately and sadly, this big fundamental issue of biodiversity is, in relative terms, receiving less attention, perhaps less attention than it should in the public discourse. And therefore, I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues with Mark and put this issue further on the map and increase awareness about why on earth is biodiversity important, and in fact, what are the links between biodiversity and the business world. So in this webinar, among many other issues, we want to understand a little bit where is this idea of a mandatory assessment and disclosure requirements on biodiversity issues headed, especially for large companies and financial institutions. And we want to understand how this assessment and this disclosure on biodiversity issues has the potential to perhaps create fair competition, increase accountability, engage investors further of issues of biodiversity, involve SMEs, empower consumers, and perhaps in some situations even help ensure the rights of indigenous peoples and communities. Now, to discuss all of that and more, it is a true pleasure and a privilege to welcome Mark Goff to our conversation. Mark is the CEO of the Capitals Coalition that used to be called Natural Capital Coalition, and Mark will tell us a little bit about the name change. But this is a global coalition of business, governments, and civil society that is transforming the way decisions are made by including the value provided by nature and people. Mark is a veteran in this space. Of course, previously, he led the Natural Capital Coalition, as I noted. He was on the board of the Social and Human Capital Coalition and worked extensively in the private sector, leading programs in strategy, including where we met some time ago at the Crown Estate. Back then. So, Mark, a very, very warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to have you. Thank you for joining. Let me start my first question. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about your current role and the focus of the Capitals Coalition?
Yes, by all means, it's wonderful to be here. I did one of these sessions with you a couple of years ago. And since then, several people have come back to me and said, it's a really great session, really energized. So it's always good to work with you, Yanis. So the Capitals Coalition has come about basically because I think most of us, particularly when we're working in business, and I worked in business for about 20 years before coming to this side of the aisle, is that when we're sitting there in business, we know we want to do certain things. We know we want to pay a fair wage. We know we want to look after the environment. That's what we do on the weekends. We go out into nature, we go out and do all those things. But when you get caught up in the business world, you're caught into these structures and processes which don't allow the feelings that I have to necessarily come through. So in a board meeting, we may be sitting there in a board meeting and I'll get my board papers and it'll tell me the financial reason why we should do something, why we should invest, why we should make a decision. But it won't tell me the reasons why nature should be protected or reserved, or why we should be looking after people or the trust in communities. Those sort of things, I have to stick my hand up in the board meeting and say, actually, can we bring that onto the agenda as well? Because it isn't actually baked into the way that business is working. So what the community that I'm involved with is doing is, and there's about 25,000 people we're now engaged with around the world that are working on this idea of value. And I'm sure there's many more that are thinking about the value that they're creating, but creating processes, methods, ways to build this into in a structured way into the decisions that we make every day, so that I don't have to stick my hand up in the board meetings. We're not doing it because of compliance or because of competition. We're doing it because we've got the information to help to make sure that the things that really matter, nature, people, economics, are all included in the decision-making processes. And just to answer your question, sorry, the Capitals Coalition, so we were the Natural Capital Coalition, we realized that we were making the same mistake as I've just set out there about finance. If we just focus on nature and don't think about the other capitals, then we're just as guilty as if we just look at the financial capital. We've got to actually start looking across them. And this came from study after study and example from businesses, from governments around the world when they were doing it, when they were getting the natural capital results and not looking at people, not looking at society, not looking at the economics as well, then you're not getting a full picture. So that's why we united all of this community together. It's difficult getting social scientists, environmental scientists, economists, accountants. They all have different languages, but we bring them together to try and mainstream and make sure that this becomes, as Yanis, you were saying, mandatory. We want to move this from what we could be doing now into what we should be doing, which is where we are now, and moving towards where we must be doing.
Thank you, Mark. There's no question in my mind, of course, that, and we have discussed this many times before, that this integrated, holistic, multidimensional level approach is the right way forward, because it, as you said, it also allows us in many ways to understand the interdependencies across all of these components of the bigger puzzle, and not just understand them and build awareness around them, but as a matter of fact, measure them, right? Produce high quality information that can and does influence decision making, whether it's corporate, whether it's policy making, whether it's in general, any sort of decision. So let me take a step back, Mark, because unlike, as I mentioned in my intro, unlike many issues like other issues like climate change, for instance, where at least on this point in time, when we talk about climate change, people know what we're talking about. Biodiversity is a term that has been used a lot, but it's been used in different contexts to have different meanings. People use alternatives like natural ecosystems, nature-based solutions, and so on and so forth. So can we just first take a step back, and if you could explain to us what do we mean by the term biodiversity? What does it, how encompassing is it? And why do we think it is so valuable and worth protecting? That's just to set the fundamentals right, if you like.
Yeah, so, and really important this, because you're completely right. The word biodiversity, nature, nature-based solutions, natural capital are often used interchangeably, and actually people tend to mean the same sort of thing. It's that green stuff outside, isn't it? That's what they're referring to. And yet they are very, very different in what we really mean by them. So nature is obviously those trees, it's the stock of resources we've got there, it's the plants, the animals, and all of those sort of things. When you bring together the biodiversity, though, biodiversity is the diversity of those things. It's the quality of the trees and the forest. It's the quality that we can bring into it. And if we're relating that back to business, if we're thinking about, well, you can grow cotton, that's great. But we know that the cotton quality is actually reducing because we're not looking after the species and things around it. So therefore, your product that you're producing is going down in quality every year. You're producing less and less good quality cotton. The biodiversity element if we have a diverse environment that cotton's growing in, we know that the quality of that cotton is improved. So that's how it really relates back to business. I'm just going to explain also natural capital, which is where we come in. So that is the resources, so the trees, the nature bit, and it's the flow of benefits that come from that. So we know that actually there's a stock of something, the number of trees we've got, and they will absorb carbon. That's a flow of benefit that is coming to people. So natural capital is the way we explain that transference between the stock and the flow. So nature is all of that green stuff. Biodiversity is the quality of that stuff, the diversity of it. And then natural capital is a process we use to understand it, to get it into decisions.
Fantastic. Very, very, very clear definition. So, Mark, just to get us, to really understand how important natural capital and biodiversity is, could you sketch for us how much do we depend on natural capital and biodiversity? Because can you, in a sense, make it real for us in terms of from our daily lives to corporates, how much do we really depend on natural capital and biodiversity?
This is one I love. So the World Economic Forum has released a report that they said that $44 trillion worth of economic value is generated because of nature, basically. And that's often the way it's quoted. The actual report, when you dig down into it, it says is highly dependent upon. So half of the world's GDP is highly dependent upon nature. Your question, though, was what is dependent? Everything is. We do not have systems such as societies or trust in communities or institutions or economic systems if there is no planet. There are no jobs on a dead planet, okay? So actually, we are completely and utterly dependent on this thing that we are deteriorating every year. Now, if you were, for example, your savings that you've got at home and you know that you've got financial savings, it's quite an easy one. If you spend down every year, I just managed to buy a new car, which I'm very pleased with, an electric car, it's great. My savings have reduced massively. I know I haven't got the resources to then go and do other things, to go on holiday next year and things. So that was a decision I made. But if I keep on reducing that stock, the natural capital, in this case, the biodiversity, well, then at some point, I'm going to not have those returns that I would expect. And if it goes below zero in your bank account, well, then you're paying them. And that's where we are now. We are dependent completely upon clean air, fresh water, the biodiversity, the pollinators, all of those things. Without that, there is no life for humans, at least on this planet, if we break that down. So it's not a case of it's $44 trillion or it's $128 trillion or whatever like that. It's everything that we do is dependent upon that nature. I was asked about the COP. It's in COP15 is happening at the same time as the World Cup. And I was asked on Sky TV about that, whether actually people should go to the World Cup or go to the Biodiversity Conference. And for a start, they're different people will go to those probably. But also, there is no football on a dead planet. I mean, there is no World Cup if we don't sort out this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's remarkable sometimes where I don't know how we got here, but I do also speak with a lot of people, especially in the corporate world, where there is this mental disconnect where people cannot actually see through the whole sort of dependence of the entire value chain or the value chain of the entire supply chain, and how it always goes back to some type of natural capital dependent. So, Mark, let me pick up on something that you said about the depletion of natural capital, because there's a lot of conversation about regenerative sort of approaches to the use of natural capital and natural resources, whereas it seems to me that as a planet we're not there yet. We're sort of struggling to minimize the harm. We're struggling to minimize deforestation. We're struggling to halt the biodiversity loss, for instance, before we even talk about regeneration. So can you help us understand a little bit about, in your experience, what are the main causes of depletion of the natural capital and the reduction in its quality? In other words, the reduction, the major loss in biodiversity that we've been talking about in recent years. What are the main causes behind that?
You're completely right about that. If you ask people on the street, if you walk up to someone tomorrow and say, do you think that we should protect the nature? You're in Hampstead Park and you say, should we protect the park here? Majority of people are going to say yes, of course they do. They want to look after nature. But once again, we're not really building that into our decision-making into our processes. When you're sitting inside your nice glass building in the City of London or in Singapore or wherever it is, and you're sitting there and you're trying to make this decision, you can see that actually there's a limit to resources maybe, and you've got to be able to get those, but costs go up, so you just pay more for it. So you find a way, you work out your process to address it. You're not connecting to the fact that 83% of species of animals and plants, according to WWF, humans, beings, have actually made extinct on this planet. 80, I mean, that is a significant number. There's so many, a billion species that are under threat at the moment. I mean, this is really significant, and we don't get that into the decisions, and this is the problem. Land use change is one of the biggest drivers of this. Converting land, we all know the stories in Latin America, converting land for beef and cattle, forests from that. The work that's going on in Brazil at the moment, where farmers are clear-cutting forests before the political change might happen. Hopefully, there might be a change there. If that happens, farmers are going out and clear-cutting lands and setting forest fires to get things through in the present political environment, because there isn't the political leadership. So there's a range of different factors here: political leadership, the way that we actually build this into decisions, the land use change is significant. There's lots of individual bits that we might do as well, the way that the consumerism that we're familiar with. There's lots of organizations working on that. I guess what I'd like to bring it back down to is in the basis of how do we make those decisions. We make them based on the information that we've got in front of us. And therefore, if we can put this into a format, and I'm not talking about monetizing the costs and the benefits, because that's one way. If you're making an investment, of course, you want to monetize it because you want to know the costs and the benefits associated with it. But lots of decisions we make are based around that qualitative or quantitative information that we've got. So it's getting that into it that will allow us to allow people to make the decisions that they want to make. And I really do believe that people want to make good decisions on this. It's just we haven't set up the systems properly to allow them to do that.
And clearly, Mark, for higher quality decision making, in a sense, we need higher quality information and usable and trustworthy and accurate information. And truth of the matter is, as you pointed out, right, a lot of these issues are taking place perhaps in geographies where we haven't yet developed perhaps the capacity to get that accurate information. So can we talk a little bit about how do you envision natural capital and biodiversity actually integrated into decision making? Because, for instance, just to draw some parallels here, right? When we talk about climate change, we have relatively more sophisticated ways of understanding it. Carbon emissions or carbon emissions equivalent, right? And which gases are exaggerating global warming and so on and so forth. So we have a basic, I would call it, understanding that through all these initiatives, for example, internal carbon pricing, carbon tax, we can translate it into dollars only because, not because it's the dollars that matter in a sense, but because the language of dollars can actually enter business decision making. Could you tell us a little bit in parallel, where are we in that process when it comes to natural capital and biodiversity? Are we yet in a position where we have developed that measurement? Do we need to develop that measurement in order to, and then translate it into business decision making? Where do we stand on that?
So you're right. Climate in many ways is easier. It's a global thing that we can basically group together into tons of CO2 equivalents. It's a proxy in many ways for some of the things that are going on, but it's also a driver of that biodiversity loss. And also with climate as well. I mean, at the moment, most of the studies show that over 30% of the climate solution is going to be nature. And yet the amount of money that's going into that in the transitions plans is about 2% of the money. So 2% of the money is only going in, while that could deliver 30% of the benefit. And when you look at technological solutions, which could be a bit less than that, they're getting a lot more of the funding. So people are going after the technological solutions when actually we've got the engine that could do this. The trees have been absorbing carbon for years. They're one of the best sinks we've got out there. And yet we're not investing in that. So there is a gap. Climate is a simpler, it's not simple, but it's a simpler way of looking at it. Biodiversity, nature is local. It's something that we have to look at in a local context. It's not something we can escalate up. So a few years ago, after the 2015 in Paris, there was a big climate COP that a lot of people here may be aware of. In that, there was an agreement to go for 2 degrees of warming. That went down after that to 1.5. So for climate, we've sort of got something to aim for, something you can benchmark yourself against. There wasn't that for nature. So a group of us, myself and Marco Lambertini from WWF and Peter Backer from WBCSD, Jen Morris, who's now at the Nature Conservancy, some of the bigger organizations that are out there working in this space. We all got together in Geneva, and we realized that the CEOs realized that all of our teams were arguing between each other and saying, oh, my way's better, my way's better. No, you can't do that. There's a technical reason why you can't do that. So the CEOs got together, we locked ourselves in a room, and we said, we're going to come out of this with a direction of travel and then tell our teams that's the way to go. Because if we keep on arguing over this, we're not going to get to where we need to be. We came out with the phrase from that meeting, the nature positive. Now, nature positive picks up on that comment you were asking earlier on about it's great that we're reducing or trying to reduce harm, but actually with this particularly, we need to start regenerative approaches. So by 2030, we want to be able to halt and reverse the nature loss. So there should be more nature in the world by 2030 than there is today. That's where we want to get to. It's going to dip though. We know it's getting worse, but by 2030, we want to be on the upward curve and going up. Is that fast enough? No. Do we want to do it quicker? Yes, all of those sort of things. But it gives us a direction of travel that is like when we start thinking about climate, what do we want to be climate neutral? Well, in this case, what we want to be is nature positive, climate neutral, nature positive. And then we also need to bring in the equitable way of doing that, the just transition. How do we do that and make sure that's fair for people, fair for communities, etc.? So an equitable, nature positive, and nature and climate neutral future is what we're looking for. There are lots of ways to measure this. So just one quick example, a food and beverage company we've been working with has started bringing in these measurements, Natural Capital way of doing this into their processes. They were offered a concession of land to grow some food in Africa. They did an assessment of it, thinking about what the land is used for, how best to use it, what the biodiversity is on the land. And they went back to the government and said, no, we're not going to take that land. Now, I'm not aware of many companies that would turn around and say, no, we're not going to take a concession, a good value deal on some land to grow some crops. They said, this isn't the right land for this crop. We've done some work ourselves. We don't think it is. We think there's some land over there that might be better. Can we talk to you about that? And while they were doing that, they found some really old cave paintings on the land that they were just about to farm on, which has now become a park, which means the communities are now engaged because they want to work it. They're supporting the farmers. They're supporting the business that has come in there. It's not just a business coming in and taking from them. They've given back. The government gave them the new land for a cheaper rate, which meant that the business then got cheaper finance from its financiers in the financial markets. It got a cheaper cost of financial capital, which meant that the sustainability director who was running that has put himself out of a job because the CFO, the financial director, is now taking it on because he's now able to control that. So that use of that information has really helped that business. It's helping it to be more economically viable. It's helping it to make better decisions, to work better in the community. It's one of those situations where natural, social, human, and economics are all coming together. Now, not every decision can be like that. Some businesses, their business models do not work in the future that we're setting out, a nature positive, climate neutral, equitable future. They're not going to work in that. And there's some really difficult decisions, but there's others like the car manufacturers. Almost all of them have worked so far with capitals in some way, this idea of capitals, in their transition to electrification, because they know they've got to look at different product lines. They've got to look at different materials, different resources. They don't want to start using resources which are going to have perverse impacts on what they're doing. So, and we know there's issues with electrification, and that's what they're working through. So I think that there are definite ways to measure this now.
Thank you, Mark. As you were speaking, I think I typed about 12 questions that I want to ask you as follow-up. And on top of that,
I'll go a bit quicker. Sorry.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, because you mentioned there are so many striking things. I'm going to start and note the one that you mentioned, like how much inadequate investment is going into solutions that have the potential, the climate solutions that have the potential to have such an impact, right? You mentioned, for instance, 2% of the investment going into nature that could impact 60%, if I remember your numbers correctly. On
over 30.
Over 30, sorry.
Yeah. It's
still a huge gap, right? So let me start asking these questions, and one that is also relevant to a question we had in from the audience, and the member of the audience is asking, how do we preserve the opportunities in nature, especially when it comes to places like Africa, because Africa does hold a huge a vast amount of the world's biodiversity and forest. So you mentioned before in your remarks that indeed biodiversity is local, and you brought in the idea that you also need political leadership in order to be able to protect it at the local level. So I think the broader question is, what are your thoughts, especially when it comes to protecting natural capital and biodiversity in Africa, that a continent that has actually suffered a lot from exploitation, right, especially of its natural resources. So how do we think about these issues in the context of Africa and more local considerations, if you like?
So this is a local issue, and there's different challenges all around the world. So one of the things that we've been doing, it was great that the community came together. We came together at Rio+20 in 2012 and started talking about this and trying to work together. But we're mainly Northern European, some American organizations that are involved in this. And we realized quite quickly that that isn't the way that we're going to solve the challenges that are around the world. I can't turn up there in my suit and start saying, well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. That's not going to work. So what we've been very much doing, and this came actually from a group of people who were all reached out to us in the same week. And we said, well, why don't you start talking together as well? So we've been helping to facilitate them. We've been helping to bring in some funding for them. We've got hubs now setting up in Nigeria and in lots of other places around Africa. We've actually got someone on the ground there now working for us in Kenya as well. So, and I think the thing is, it does have to be local. We have to think about what is relevant to them, and the responsibility, the skills, the resources that they're bringing into it, if we can help to support them through that process. And in fact, this week, we're starting a set of global dialogues with all of those hubs around the world that are starting to look at this so that they can start sharing their experiences. There's some things that are going on in Latin America which are fascinating, particularly to some of the people that we're talking to in Indonesia at the moment. They're finding that very interesting about some things that they could learn that they might be able to build on. So there's something about sharing which we can help them to share, but there's something very much about the local approaches. And in Africa particularly, we ran an African forum last couple of years there, trying to bring together the hubs and the people that are working there and helping them to be able to engage more with each other and to find more solutions. And particularly in places like Uganda, they're looking at a natural capital based green economy. So a change in the way that their economics is running, so that they move from what is into a medium economic country, a low to medium economic country. But they're doing that by preserving and looking after their resources and realizing that that's the asset base that they're going to grow off. They're not going to be cutting it down in order to pay for the economic gain, which is what we did in the UK and other places. So being able to build from that, in Costa Rica, some of the stuff that's going on there at the moment, the basin in the several basins in Africa as well, where there's a lot of work going on there at the moment, where they're actually using that and they're investing more in nature than they're taking out at the moment already. Then they're already nature positive, some of those African countries. There is a massive threat with species loss. There's a massive threat with species transference and things to other countries. Some of the farming practices and things are really difficult. So it's not, I'm not saying it's all a good solution, but we do need to have this connection between the political will through to where the finance is flowing. Nigeria is doing a lot of work around that, finance with the African Development Bank, all the way through to where businesses every day are practicing. And for that needs conversations. It needs to sit down with each other.
Thank you, Mark. You won't be surprised to know that it's not just me. The conversations from the audience are flowing in, and you probably can see them on your screen as well, which is fantastic. I think we have a very engaged audience with some very brilliant questions. So let me try to streamline some of them related to the issues that we're talking, because you were just mentioning the financials. And one member of the audience is asking, can you give us a rough idea of the amount that of money, of funds, that would be required so that the changes that you described can be a reality by 2030. And I guess my thinking here is as well is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but many people might think about the same thing about climate change, and they say, oh, it's very expensive. And then of course the answer is, well, wait until you see what happens when you don't address climate change, right? So do we have in the ballpark estimated figures of how much this is going to cost us, and especially if we account for not only the stopping the harm side of things, but as you mentioned earlier, all these if we account also for the potential benefits created by their dependencies, right? Like preserving or regenerating natural capital and biodiversity clearly is going to have huge implications for our ability to meet our climate targets, for instance. So what is our current understanding, if you like, of the cost and benefits of protecting natural capital and biodiversity?
So the first thing, obviously, Nick Stern's report on climate, people will be very familiar with. Hopefully, that set out the economics for climate. Professor Dasgupta did this for the Treasury, and this is the key thing. The Treasury sponsored it. It wasn't DEFRA, it wasn't the Environment Agency, it wasn't the Greenies on one side. It was the Economic Centre asked Professor Dasgupta to produce this, and it came through Treasury, and he produced some figures. There's now another one just being written now, which we're sort of helping out with, which is the economics of the water system, which I think is really key as well. And that'll be launched next March in New York at the UN Water Conference. So there are lots of figures here, and I'll give you a few of them, but just be aware, I get a little bit overwhelmed sometimes with the number of zeros on these things, and they become a bit pointless in my day-to-day life. On what I'm doing, having trillions and billions of dollars doesn't actually mean that much to me. So some of the numbers are, so it's about 300 billion per year that the cost of some of the natural disasters, that's just on the natural disasters, that's what's costing us at the moment. That's going up considerably. There is the health of the economy from ocean health, about 428 billion there. There's $44 trillion worth of economic value generation. So that we're getting into the trillions there. Some people have got that up as high as 70 trillion, because it's obviously that's the average, but there's a range within that. And the services that are provided from nature, we're getting up to about 125 trillion. So, I mean, we're talking so many zeros on this, it's difficult to comprehend. I think one of the things with these numbers, though, is that every single study, and there's been lots of them done now, Stanford University has just done one, another one. There's been lots of others done by universities around the world and by professors and other people. Almost every single time, I've never seen a study that doesn't say it's better to invest today for what you're going to get out tomorrow. The costs are going to be higher if we do nothing than if we do something. So that message is clear. No matter which number of those numbers you choose, it's always better. There's one other thing with this, which is really important. We did a report last year with, or beginning of this year actually, with Business for Nature, which we set up as an advocacy arm to take into things with some partners, and with the B Team, which is Richard Branson's body that brings together leaders from around the world. And we took this study, we took a meta study of all of the subsidies that are being paid at the moment that are anti-nature, that are actually destroying nature. Okay, that came out with, over the last 10 years, 1.8 trillion a year that is going in the wrong direction. So no matter what we do, we've got to reverse that. Those subsidies that are going into bad agricultural practices, into supporting oil and gas and things like that, they've got to be reversed. If we can reverse those, and you go to a government and say, there's $1.8 trillion that's going in the wrong direction, their first thought is, oh, can we have that money back? We're saying, maybe some of it, but actually let's redirect that, put that in as positive. Then all of these things we're talking about, then you start seeing this up curve. Then you start getting the money going to the businesses, the organizations that are doing the good things, not the bad things. So the subsidy reform is going to be key in this next phase that we're going into. But we've now got some of that data. We're now working closely with the regulators, with the companies and others to make sure that that changes. And in fact, in Montreal later this year, there will be Target 18 in that one, is the one on subsidies reform, etc. Target 15 on the mandatory, which I think we'll get to in a minute. But Target 18 is on the subsidies. And we're hoping that actually that will see a change in that. Because without that, no matter what we do, no matter what frameworks, no matter what we do, we're pushing uphill. So we've got to get the money to flow in the right direction.
Great. So since we are talking about that negative flow of money, and clearly, as you just explained, policy it's fundamental, right? Like everything, but we also need mobilization across all levels, and clearly the involvement and mobilization of corporates is a very important component here, right? So in your view, Mark, what is it that companies can do here? Because we talked about the measurement issue earlier, but we already see initiatives, and including the initiatives that you described and that you led, and others, like, for instance, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for instance, that are particularly targeted towards informing companies about biodiversity and coming up with the metrics that perhaps they would need, right, in order to elevate the quality of their decision making. So I guess it's a two-part question. So first of all, what are your views about initiatives like the task force that are trying to quantify these impacts? And second of all, given those kinds of measures and any other initiatives to quantify, what is it that you feel that businesses, more specifically in the private sector, can contribute towards preserving and regenerating natural capital and biodiversity?
So it can get very confusing because to be honest, there's a new initiative almost every week, it seems, a new framework, a new set of metrics, a new set of tools that you can use. So what we've been doing as a community that produces those things is starting to review this and say, actually, what does the user need? Because we're at that stage now. It's great. We were in a period over the last 10 years or so of, we've got to test this out. We're doing some piloting and all that. We now need to move into a more standardized way of doing it. And that's the phase we're in. I think we're maturing a little bit. I think we're still probably teenagers. I think we discussed this last time we were on there. I don't think we're quite, grown up. We think we're a bit older than we are in this space. But we do need to start maturing it and making sure it's standardized. So one of the key things we've done is myself, Tony Goldner, who runs the TNFD, Erin Billman, who runs the Science-Based Targets for Network, which is on Nature, Eva Zabi, who runs the Business for Nature, and various others of us in this space, the World Economic Forum, WBCSD, and others. We've all looked at our frameworks and said, well, they're all pretty similar, actually. They're all doing something, they're all taking a little bit of the pie, so they're toolbox. It's actually, you need to choose the right tool for the right job, but actually it's very confusing the way we talk about it. I go out there and say, you've all got to use capitals. Tony goes out there and says, you've all got to use the TNFD. Erin says you've got to use science-based targets. From a user's perspective, that's a nightmare. So what we've all agreed on is that actually there's consistency, the commonality between our frameworks and how we can connect those up. And that is that we assess, first of all, you need to, as a business, assess what you're doing. To do that, you need to understand your impacts and dependencies. Well, we can help you with that from what we're doing here, okay? The capitals is a good way to think about that. Then what you need to do once you've assessed, you need to commit. Well, then you need to go and see Erin and start talking to the targets and start thinking about that. Now, is there a connection between the target setting and the assess? Of course there is. And some of the work that the Science-Based Targets is doing is consistent. And we're making sure that it's consistent with what we do in the assess bucket is what they're doing there in their commitment bucket. And what Tony's doing with the TNFD is also consistent. We released a paper 2 weeks ago. That's based on some work that we were doing. Emily McKenzie, who's the technical director there, used to work with us. So all of that output that TNFD is doing, feel confident that is connected. You can pick up the protocol that we've written one day, what they're doing the next. There's consistency in that. They're two different tools for different things. Because what Tony's doing is the disclosure bit. He's helping you to put that into a format to be able to disclose. So each of us, it's a baton passing. 66% of the businesses when we did the review that we've worked with on natural capital and social and human capital are now looking at setting targets with Erin Billman through that science-based targets network. Now that 2/3 of them are just taking that next step. Some of them are new, they need to come back and start thinking about assess as well. But from a user perspective, it is actually much simpler than it seems. And we're gonna be coming out this loop behind me. I can send that around later. That shows you how some of those connections are made. And we can see how these, you pass on from a user to the next one. But what can you do? The Business for Nature website is one of the best ones to go to. We've set out on there that loop and various other steps on there. It sets out the actions of what you would want to do to be able to, I'm just bringing it up now to make sure I'm not being wrong with this, to set out the actions about what you would need to do to be able to go through that process in a very simple stepping stone basis that you can go in there and you can say, okay, I've done that one. What do I do next?
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And I'm very cognizant of time because when you're talking about such exciting and important issues and with so much passion and depth that you do, time really does fly. So I want to, I'll take more questions, and a number of the questions that I posed to you, as you can see, are already from the audience. I want to turn to COP15 now, in terms of if you could explain to us, right, what are the expectations for COP15? It's taking place in December. It's taking place in Montreal after being postponed, if I recall correctly. So what are the expectations? What's the best that we can hope for on COP15? What do you think are going to be the hot issues? Because again, I feel that this is a bit neglected. We talk about a lot about loss and damage at COP27, that companies haven't committed and renewed their climate targets. But can you tell us a little bit about COP15 that focuses on biodiversity? What expectations and what hopes perhaps are we going into, and how that might affect businesses in the private sector more specifically?
Yeah, so to me, the COP27 in Egypt, which I'll be at in a couple of weeks' time, is going to be an important stepping stone towards COP15. COP15 is the one that we're really focusing on, and not because we think biodiversity is more important than climate or anything like that. It's because they're all interconnected and climate is connected to it. But COP15 offers us a really big opportunity here. It's a review of the global biodiversity framework, the overall framework, and everything in the end. Biodiversity nature is the bottom layer. Without that, that crumbles, everything else crumbles. So we've got to get that bit right. Climate is one of those things, like I said, a proxy that comes from it. There are three things coming from this biodiversity COP. The first one is the global biodiversity framework itself. It's got to be ambitious. It's got to be led. Trudeau, who was in New York when we were running some events over there, I was fortunate enough to meet him, is really getting behind this. So we've got political support from several countries, including now the country that is nominally hosting it. Obviously, China's still the official host, but it's being run in Canada. So we've got to get that global biodiversity framework to include this nature positive approach. That overall arching global goal has got to be ambitious in that bit. That's the first bit. Second one, target 15. And this one is really important. There's lots of targets in this one. I'm just picking out two of them. Target 15 is the mandatory assessment and disclosure of impacts and dependencies. Everything we've spoken about today, if we got that in, then that means that large businesses, at least at the beginning, financial institutions, governments, we're now at over 80 governments that are now doing natural capital accounts. The US signed up in April. President Biden finally signed it. I actually went to see the previous administration too before Obama. We made some recommendations. There was a 5-year hiatus where nothing happened. When Biden got in, they're now applying that. And some of the team that we were working with are now in the White House helping to apply that. So, but that target 15, mandatory, that's being called for by businesses. We actually reached out. We're taking a delegation to Montreal. We reached out to businesses. We've had over 400 businesses say they want to send their senior representatives with us to Montreal to make that announcement. I mean, that is significant to take that many businesses. We can't take them on our delegations. We're working with partners. We've set this up as a partnership with other organizations to get them in there. And this make it mandatory is being called for by business. Businesses are calling for it, and the governments are saying, what, you want us to regulate? And then businesses are saying, yes, we need this. We can't run our businesses if we don't have this as a level playing field, if we're not actually understanding where these things are. The last thing is, so three things: global biodiversity framework, target 15, target 18 was the subsidies one, that bit I was talking about before. Get the money to flow in the right direction. If we can get those three, then I'm really, I think it would be a positive outcome. How confident am I? There's 1,800 brackets still in this document. Now, a bracket in a legal document means that actually it hasn't been agreed yet. There's still a discussion, 1,800 of them. So I've got this plan that we're going to work with Microsoft, and we're going to take some people out to Canada the week before. We can go around every computer and take the bracket keys off. If we take them off, then we've solved the problem for COP15. So I think that it's a big concern. We're not going to come out with everything we always want to. We never do from these big negotiations. But I think if we can get those three things, then we'll be moving definitely in the right direction.
Brackets issue then. Mark, so we again drawing the parallels with climate negotiations that are highly contested, highly political. You have the divide of the global north with the global south, and therefore it's becoming impossible to get to an agreement. You have the loss and damage issue that developed countries are so hesitant and reluctant. So are there negotiation kind of conflicts or equivalents when we come to in other words, are these negotiations at COP15 as contested and as political as climate change are? Are they worse? Are they better? Just give us your experience, and I'm guessing not just COP15. You've been to previous biodiversity COPs as well. How do the negotiations take place when it comes to these issues as opposed to climate?
So there's some big problems with the biodiversity one. One, the US is not a signatory. to the conference on biodiversity, but they have just announced this week they're going to send a senior official to this conference, which might be the starting of them signing up to it. But I mean, the US is a significant power in this space, particularly on negotiations. If they're not a signatory, well, that's a bit out. We're not going to get the same political leadership turning up at the COPs. The climate COP, you get every leader wants to be seen there with the other leaders. You don't get that at the biodiversity COP. It's also different negotiators. There's a different team in the UK government that goes to the climate COP than goes to the biodiversity COP. So you've got people that are not talking in different departments, which is another challenge there. You've got the usual breakdown between certain countries that block just because other countries, like Eurovision, no one ever wants to vote for certain countries, so they always give them nil point. And actually, it's the same thing here. You've got political bits coming into something which shouldn't be political. We're talking about a global commons. We're talking about something that we all depend upon. We shouldn't be fighting over other things while in those negotiations, but that's often what happens. And when we turn up and the negotiators are only given the piece of paper with their red lines on, you can't go outside of this. So the negotiating power is very weak. So if we don't bring those international leaders to this, then it doesn't work. What changed for the climate is that was the way it used to be with climate. In 2015, and it was only 3 or 4 weeks really beforehand, business really got motivated and got behind it. When business stepped into the negotiations, that was when the political leaders stood up and started listening. That was when we started getting the breakthroughs in what was going on. That was when we got the target. That's why it's so important that actually we take businesses into this COP, because it is that when so much of taxes for governments comes through businesses, that's where they've really funded from, is from business. If business is going in with positive, not negative, but positive legislation, positive mandatory approaches, positive opportunities for what they can do, that's what will help to move this, I think.
And since you did mention business, Mark, one of the concerns, though, is that COP27 might not live up to expectations, and we already read in the media that businesses might not be, and especially in investors, more specifically the financial system, might not be showing up for COP27 in the same way that they showed up at COP26, and we had the Net Zero Alliance and so on and so forth. Do you think that, clearly from one perspective, a failure at COP27 will only highlight how important COP15 is going to be, but realistically, though, if we have a let's call it less than optimal outcome at COP27, how do you expect that to impact how the biodiversity conference is going to take place or be able to achieve?
You're very right, and remember, it goes to the Middle East after Egypt as well next year. So we've got that to build up to, and there's not as many people going. I wasn't going to go to Egypt myself. I've changed my mind. I am going to go, because we can't allow this, as you say, to not succeed. But I was wondering about how much value there would be in actually, traveling halfway around the world to go to one of these things. We are going to launch some work about digitalization there, which is about actually starting to tag all of this information in systems. So it doesn't matter which framework you refer to, you can get it off. We're going to run a nature zone there. So we're actually working with the Global Commons Alliance and various other partners to actually start making sure there's a stepping stone to the biodiversity COP, that actually we can bring in those conversations, which we did successfully. I think 92% of the nationally determined contributions on climate that came out of Glasgow included nature actually as part of the solution. Now, when we went into that, we were thinking maybe 10, 15%. 92% is brilliant to get to that level. We need to build on that here. You're completely right. We need to make the COPs, both COPs work, and we need to get rid of some of the rubbers, would be the joke that comes on the back of that one, maybe, COPs and rubbers. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. I'm cognizant that we have 10 minutes left, and I'm now very eager to explore some of the questions that the audience members have submitted. There's many. Let me pick, and if we can be as concise as we can in the answers to find. Yeah. So let's start with one that an audience member submitted, and it says the main nature-based solution that she sees around today is planting trees. Although this is good, it does not seem to be the most efficient solution to harvest the benefits of more nature and higher carbon capture. How do you see the trends of nature-based solutions evolving?
Nature-based solutions has been around for an awful long time. It's having a resurgence, which is great. You can't do it unless you understand your impacts and dependencies, so pick up the protocol first. You're completely right. Trees are seen as a golden silver bullet for a lot of this. And actually, it's about the integrity of the system that we should be looking at. So it's about the connected systems. And we've been doing a lot of work on that. It's not just about planting more trees. We've seen some projects where they're cutting down forests to plant more trees for nature-based solutions. And it's about how integral the system is holding together. That's what we should be looking at. And there's several of us that are working on that more to bring that into the processes that are being used.
And this links to the numbers that you gave us earlier, because one of our audience members is asking, if nature-based solutions are only getting 2% of the capital allocated, how can we incentivize or improve the pricing of the benefit of biodiversity solutions in favor of nature as opposed to technology? And we know, like, technology in particular has a really big advocates out there, right? For example, Bill Gates tends to think that, you know, climate change is it's more of a technological challenge, for instance, and really believes in that aspect. But clearly the numbers that you gave us say that we are at the very least not balancing this out correctly, right? So what more can be done to rebalance the investment, do you think?
So the money isn't going into the right places, but part of this is around the biodiversity credit system, which is being set up now. So there's lots of companies every day starting to come around with these ideas about how do we make sure that the money is flowing into the biodiversity systems. The problem that we had with climate is that when we started looking about climate markets and things, we said we don't need governance, markets will run that for us. And what we realized quite quickly is that we're not getting the real price, the proper price. We're not paying the price for carbon that we should be paying, is because we didn't put those governance systems in place. So what we're trying to do now, and this is key to this, is we need to have, I'm not talking about top-down regulation, I'm talking about governance in the broad sense. We need to have a governance system about what we mean about getting money into that system that is robust, that is reliable, that can be audited. If we can get that in place, which is what a lot of us are working on at the moment, then that system becomes viable. And I don't think we did it well with climate. I think we can do much better with biodiversity.
Thank you. There's a comment that I'm going to translate into a question as well, because I think it's an important one. One of our audience members says that they feel it's important to create initiatives that actually reward and showcase perhaps excellence in this space in terms of how you deal with natural capital and biodiversity. So I'll be very straightforward, Mark. And what are your favorite examples? What would you characterize as an example of excellence in terms of perhaps how the corporate sector, because we did talk about policy and governments and so on, but in terms of, and you don't have to name particular companies if you don't want to, but perhaps broader initiatives that showcase the type of positive impact and that companies can have on these topics?
So the first one has to be Patagonia, where I'm sure you saw the announcement a week or so ago that they've realized that the only stakeholder is the planet, and actually all of the shareholder, sorry, is the planet, and all of the profits are now going to go. I mean, that is a brilliant example. Not every business is going to be able to do it that way, but the B Corp idea, the idea that actually can we start bringing together a purpose-driven, and purpose is becoming a lot more important. There's now a new publicly available standard, 808 is the number, PAS 808, looking specifically at purpose. Funnily enough, they put capitals in as the bedrock of that. You've got to understand your impact and dependency. So I think that purpose-driven is important. There are others in the retail sector. Kering, as I'm sure you're aware of, Gucci, all those very high-end brands, has been working for years on having an understanding of its profit and loss that it's doing. That's now being picked up by many others. Natura in Latin America, now Natura & Co. also owning the Body Shop and other brands like that. They've just come out with their next integrated profit and loss approaches, and they're really starting to build that into the decisions that they make. Olam was the food ingredients company I was talking about earlier that's getting preferential finance. So there's plenty of examples out there. We've actually got a case study database. You can go in there and you can find your favorites from that. We've been collecting them from World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Business for Social Responsibility, various other members around the community that have been doing work in the space. We bring them all together into a consistent way. So you can go onto our website and maybe come back and let me know which is your favorite of the stories there.
Great. And equivalently, Mark, if we were to talk about the industry level, which industries do you think are more laggards in this space? What are the industries that you feel should do more and perhaps should be pressured to do more?
Well, there's three sectors which have to do more rather than they're not doing at the moment. So food and agriculture is key. A lot of the not just the emissions, but the land use change, all of that is down to food and agriculture. We're putting a really big focus on that. We've got operational guidance for business to help them through that step-by-step process. We've actually been running training and resourcing. We've done an online course to actually help people in that sector. We work with about 600 organizations in 7 countries so far on that food and agricultural change. That's key. Built environment is the next one. That one, and infrastructure. That is going to be significant to be able to get that change. We've actually been working with the procurement system for the UK government, which is now being rolled around other places, where when they now procure based on the value created and lost, rather than a tick box exercise, have I done climate? So the value toolkit that the Construction Innovation Hub in the UK has got using is now going to be rolled out around the world. We can change procurement processes in big governments on the built environment. That is going to have massive support. And we've got lots of the business companies, building companies coming in on that. The last one is energy. They're the 3 major sectors. We've got to transform the energy sector. We all know that. There's lots of work going on. The way out of this downturn we're in at the moment is to invest more and more in renewables and local generation and less in coal and gas. No matter what any politician tells you, that was the way we got into the problem. That's not the way out of it.
Great. Thank you, Mark. One more question, and then I'll close it. I think it's a big one, but I'll ask it anyway and see if we can have an answer. Someone from the audience says, are there financial or commercial models that African nations more specifically can deploy in a well-structured manner to ensure that the targets that you mentioned earlier? And is there some institutional oversight? For example, is the World Bank, which we're hearing a lot about these days, or the IMF, are there any of those institutions monitoring or even regulating some of these models in Africa more specifically?
Yes, there are, and we all of those, World Bank, IFC, IMF, all of those others are a part of our community. OECD, we're working closely with from more developed countries as well. In Africa specifically, the African Development Bank, we've been working very closely with. So don't think about the World Bank, think about the African Development Bank. We can put people in touch. If people want to get in touch with me through our website or through you, we can actually help to make some of those connections there. We're working with the Global Green Growth Knowledge Platform. They've been helping a lot with that Global Green Growth Institute as well in Africa. They've been part of it. Economics for Nature is a program of work really trying to drive that change in Africa. It's just that program's coming to an end. I'm sure there'll be more coming up. But I think that actually you're completely right. Get the finance right. Let's make sure we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you. So, Mark, we are at the top of the hour. This has been brilliant. I think we covered much more than I ever hoped that we will. It's such wide-ranging and deep conversations as well. So allow me on behalf of London Business School, the Wheeler Institute, and the Business Schools for Climate Leadership to thank you for so generously giving us your time today, and even more importantly, sharing these deep insights about an issue that is so fundamental going forward. It's, as always, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to host you, and I look forward to welcoming you also in person at London Business School. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today, for the fantastic engagement and the brilliant questions that you submitted to Mark. And last but not least, this, as I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar would not have been possible without the support of the Wheeler Institute. Tiago, the executive director, as well as the team at the Wheeler, thank you so much for supporting us and organizing this webinar. Once again, have a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are, and look out. We will have more events and more engagement on these very, very important issues as London Business School. So thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Have a great one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.